Welcome to our presentation for 611. This is our behavior change project. This is conducted by Brian, Brianna, Megan, and Brittany. To start, the purpose of our study is to gain experience in replicating a study. We will gain this by performing a study and creating a behavior change project by self-evaluating ourselves, doing different yoga poses. We then will analyze this data just like they did in the study. For our literature review, we looked at 3 different articles, the first 2 being about yoga and their effects, and the third being about self-evaluation. So to start, yoga has been around for hundreds of years. It recently has been used to help with mental health. According to Gerber et al., a study occurred in Texas, and this study provided that even one class of therapeutic yoga changed participants' emotional state and their mindfulness. So as you can see, the effects of yoga are very powerful. And another study in Maryland also described similar effects of yoga. So not only does it benefit physical health, but it also benefits mental health, and this was Ross and Thomas. Continuing with that, the results of the study showed that yoga was equal or even superior to every other physical exercise, and that yoga can also be helpful in all populations as well, and it is something that all populations can do. So as part of our study is learning 3 different yoga poses, we were able to receive these effects of yoga. Not only did we perform yoga poses, but we also used self-evaluation to hopefully better that performance. So self-evaluation creates a positive relationship between self-motivation and self-validation in order to reach those personal goals. So this was a study done by Bruce et al., and they compared this to outside evaluation and input. So the study occurring in Canada provided information showing that self-evaluation can create these positive outcomes in performance and creating that self-validation that was discussed before. So combining a mood enhancer such as yoga and self-evaluation that creates that self-validation, there should be many positive effects when these are performed together. So that is something that our study puts together. It's the effects of video self-evaluation on skill acquisition with yoga positions. Moving on to the methods of the project, we have our participants and settings. The participants included 3 females and a male: Brittany 24, Brianna 24, Megan 27, and Brian 39. All the participants are master's students, and they are involved in online courses. The 4 participants all live in the Central Time Zone but do not reside in the same state. Brianna and Brian both had injuries during the study. Brianna with mild scoliosis, and Brian had a shoulder surgery during the study. He is also undergoing physical therapy while doing the yoga poses. So none of the group members have done yoga on a regular basis. The participants took data every day, Sunday through Saturday, for about 20 to 30 minutes. This study happened over several weeks in the home setting, so that was the bedroom, family room. It was in some sort of home setting. Each participant was interested in learning to perform and better their yoga skills. Next, we have our materials. Each participant used a computer to watch 3 different YouTube videos. They needed a camera or phone to record themselves as they attempted the different yoga poses. A yoga mat, not required, but something we all had, and a datasheet to mark each step of the pose as correct or incorrect. There were a list of these steps on the datasheet, and each participant marked a plus or a minus based on whether they did that part of the pose correctly. The YouTube videos demonstrated the tree pose, the warrior two pose, and the downward facing dog pose. There was an instructor on each YouTube video showing how to do each step, both verbally and visually. When it came to holding the different poses, the virtual instructor provided feedback to when the time was up, so each participant knew whether they had held the pose for that specific amount of time. Group members used Google Drive and email to share their IOA and their progress with the poses. After performing and recording the pose, the participant would self-evaluate the pose by rewatching the video, and then again providing that correct or incorrect on their data sheet for each specific step. The group members tracked percentage correct after this to see whether what they had correctly for their poses. They would take the correct amount of steps and divide that by the total number of steps so that they could see what percentage of the pose they got correctly. Here are those data sheets that I referred to. As you can see on the left, we have the steps, and this varied based on the pose. So some of the poses had 21 steps versus on the next slide you will see 14 steps, and then the next column you will see the plus or minus, so whether the participant got that step correct or incorrect, and then at the very bottom of the sheet we would put the percentage correct. So again, we would take the correct number of steps and divide it by the total number of steps to get that percent independence. And to the right of this slide, you will see our percent correct data sheet. So this will just compile for each day what percentage of steps we got correct and incorrect, and then we used those percentages to put into our graphs and see where we were based on the percent correct.
The first pose was the tree pose, which was operationally defined as a balancing pose in which the individual stands on one leg while the other leg is bent to the side with the bottom of their foot pressed to their inner knee and their arms raised above their head with their palms touching. The second pose is the warrior pose 2, which is operationally defined as a stretch pose in which the individual's legs are spread apart sideways with one leg straight and the foot pointing forward and the other leg bent at the knee to the side with the foot facing to the side. Arms are straight out to the side with the torso facing forward and the head facing the direction of the bent leg. The third pose is a downward facing dog, which is operationally defined as a stretch pose in which an individual is standing with both their feet touching the floor, heels included, and their legs straight with their hips bent forward so their bottom are facing upwards and their hands are fully on the floor with their fingers spread. As in the original study, we collected data using a video camera and a task analysis. For each session, each participant would attempt 3 different yoga poses. All 3 poses must be held for at least 30 seconds in order for that pose to be counted as correct. The percentage of steps correct were measured and recorded on a task analysis data sheet. Each participant would graph their daily data on a multiple baseline design across behaviors graph. Group updates were conducted through Google Docs, video conference calls, and a conversation via text.
The design for our study, we used a multiple baseline design to graph and share our data just as the original study did. This was to ensure that we looked at each individual pose and the progress for that pose.
So for our baseline phase, the participant, we watched a YouTube video that demonstrated each pose and broke it down step by step. Then we performed the 3 different yoga poses, and after that, we didn't receive feedback from the YouTube video. We just completed the poses because it was for baseline. We collected the baseline data for 10 minutes for each pose, and then we scored the poses in vivo. So for our treatment phase, the participants will attempt each pose 2 to 3 times during each assessment session. During video recording of each phase, the experimenter set one camera on a tripod or use our phone to record. We press record and stop button at the beginning and end of each pose. The video camera will be faced to the front of the participant. Video self-reflection. Following baseline, participants will begin video evaluation. Participants will immediately record and watch their video and evaluate their pose using a task analysis to score each step of the pose. The first 2 sessions consisted of the participant watching their videos and the video on YouTube. They then compared their pose to the poses on YouTube. This kind of acted as a meeting between the researcher and the participant. We then compared the videos and modified our pose to match the poses in the video. The participants will use a task analysis and score their data using our data sheet. Data will be recorded using an A+ for a correct pose and an A- for an incorrect pose, or a plus or minus. For the following sessions, participants will score their videos on their own without rewatching the YouTube videos. But during these sessions, if the treatment falls below 80%, the participant's performance falls below 80%, then retraining will occur, which will be 15 minutes, and it will be like watching the YouTube video again before we're able to complete the data. So for our IOA, or our Interserver agreement, we, during the intervention, we recorded ourselves doing our yoga poses, and then we uploaded them to Google Drive. We then had each participant, or each other, watch one agreed upon video of each other and recorded the task analysis using the data sheets. Then submitted the data back to the original participant to record the IOA. In other words, one participant would send out their data to another person, and they would record their data and then send back, kind of like a round robin or something similar to that. We calculated IOA by counting the number of correct instances of agreements between observers for each step in the task analysis. We then took the number of agreements and then divided them by the total number of steps in each task. Then we turned that into a percentage. Treatment integrity. So to make sure we had good treatment integrity, we calculated a percentage of agreement on performance of the steps in our task analysis as we conduct our video self-evaluation. We came up with this percentage by dividing the number of agreements by the number of agreements plus disagreements, and then convert that number to a percentage. If we fall below 80%, participant will engage in implementing the correct steps, including the correct YouTube video, and giving feedback to each other to maintain treatment fidelity. So in other words, kind of keeping a check on each other, making sure we're doing it correctly. For our data averages and ranges, which consisted of our percentage of steps completed in the task analysis. For a yoga pose 1, the tree pose, Brian's baseline average was 59%. Brianna's baseline average was 95%. Brittany's baseline average was 54%. And Megan's baseline average was 100%. The baseline range, Brian's was 50 to 65. Brianna's was 85 to 100%. Brittany's was 52 to 57%, and Megan's was 100%. On the feedback average, Brian's was 70%, Brittany's was 66%, and Megan's was 100%. On the video feedback range, Brian's was 60 to 80%, Brittany was 52 to 76%, and Megan was 100%. The data average and ranges for pose 2, the warrior pose. Brian's baseline average was 63%, Brianna's was 96%, Brittany's was 53%, and Megan's was 94%. For the baseline range, Brian's was 60 to 70%, Brianna's was 90 to 100%, Brittany's was 50 to 60%, and Megan's was 90 to 100%. Next on the video feedback, the average was 70% for Brian, 70% for Brittany, and Megan had 96%. The range of the video feedback for Brian was 60 to 80%, for Brittany it was 60 to 75%, and for Megan it was 90 to 100%. The data average and ranges for the yoga pose 3, or the downward dog pose. Brian's baseline average was 55%. Brianna's baseline average was 94%. Brittany's baseline average was 81%, and Megan's baseline average was 86%. Our ranges for the baseline, Brian's was 50 to 60%. Brianna's was 80% to 100%, Brittany's was 79% to 86%, and Megan's was 79% to 93%. Moving on to the video feedback average for the downward dog pose, Brian's average was 69%, Brittany's average was 96%, and Megan's average was 93%. The video feedback range, Brian's was 60 to 75%, Brittany's was 93 to 100%, and Megan's was 93%.
Next, we are going to look at each participant's graph. To start, we did use a multiple baseline graph. As you can see, we have our 3 poses on each tier of the graph. And based on Brittany's graph, there was a steady increase or a positive trend on each part of the graph. And this did show that self-evaluation of the yoga poses was accurate, and the hypothesis was correct in this case. Next, we have Megan's graph, and as you can see, hers is a little bit different from Brittany's. It is set up the same way, but as you can see, her tree pose is right off the bat, even from baseline. She showed that she had 100% on that, where the next 2, there was an increase in her trend. So I would say overall, especially looking at the last two tiers, that she did have a functional relationship between her yoga poses and her self-evaluation. Finally, we're going to look at Brian's personal graph. There is a functional relationship between the yoga poses and the self-evaluation. From baseline into intervention, you can see that there is a positive trend throughout each of his graphs for each pose.
Based on the results, it can be concluded that video self-reflection increased the accuracy of yoga poses for all participants. For the first pose, all participants' baseline started at a moderate to high level. Following the intervention, the graphs indicated an increasing trend, with the exception of Megan, who remained stable. For the second pose, all participants' baselines started at a moderate to high level. Following the intervention, the graphs indicated an increasing trend, with the exception of Megan, who had an initial moderate to high magnitude change and then a stable trend. For the third pose, all participants' baselines started stable or had a low increasing trend. Following the intervention, the graphs indicated an increasing or stable trend. As shown in the original study, the intervention of self-reflection displayed a functional relationship between increased accuracy of yoga poses.
Finally, we have our limitations of the study. So to start, two of the participants, Brianna and Brian, both had injuries, which caused some discrepancy in the data due to not being able to perform fully the poses that they were given. So I know specifically Brian could not maneuver his shoulder due to the shoulder surgery for the downward facing dog pose. So this obviously hindered his ability to do that, which caused some discrepancy between the actual study and our replication. The two participants in the original study were both healthy and had no injuries, so they were able to fully do these poses. Next, in the original study, if the participants fell below 80% treatment integrity, then they were retrained by the person in charge of the study on how to evaluate the different poses. This was not something our group was able to do because we could not involve outside sources. So if we fell below that 80%, we would try to discuss where the discrepancies came from, but we were not able to be retrained like they were in the original study. So of course in the original study there wasn't much room for observer bias or observer drift to occur because they were frequently being retrained for their self-evaluating, where for us these two things may have occurred. So going off of that limitation, we also were not able to officially be trained in our replication for knowing what looked correct versus incorrect. We are not yoga specialists, so we don't know if what we are doing is correct or incorrect. So in the original study, the experimenter was able to go through and show the participants what looked correct and what didn't. We unfortunately weren't able to get that feedback, so this caused, again, a discrepancy in our replication because we never received that original training. The only thing we had a reference to were the videos that we watched on YouTube. And finally, the original study also used two independent observers who were unaware of the experimental conditions for the study, and these two independent observers provided the IOA for 33% of the study. So again, we were unable to use outside sources for this replication, so we were not able to receive that unbiased feedback for IOA. We did watch each other's videos to create that IOA, but it wasn't the same effect as if we were to use someone outside of the replication. This, however, could have caused some observer biases during the replication, so obviously that wouldn't happen if two independent observers were able to be a part of our replication, but unfortunately we weren't able to do that, so we were unable to get that observer, not have that observer bias during our replication. So those are all of the limitations for our study.